What is the most famous horse in history? Bucephalus, ox head. It was Alexander the Great's horse. This was one of the early spectacular feats of Alexander's youth, actually, before he even became king. When his father, Philip II, was king, there was a rather large horse. They were actually on the, what you'd call the lot where you bring livestock and horses to purchase. Basically an ancient auction, and this horse was brought, and the owner was charging a rather outrageous fee for this large horse, but no one could tame it. No one could get it to calm down. No one could ride it. Alexander the Great, of course, he wasn't the great yet. He was little Alex, teenager, I think about 16 maybe a little younger than that. He actually berated the men who were trying to control this horse, and he noticed that the horse was actually afraid of his own shadow. He noticed that whenever the horse moved and his shadow moved within eyeshot, the horse would get spooked. And if you ride horses, you know horses can get spooked rather easily. I don't know if they get spooked by shadows very much, but anything slithering behind it will make a horse just bolt off, unless it's super well trained, of course. But Alexander turned the horse around and jumped on top of it, and the horse, of course, took off. And he turned it back around, and to the astonishment of everyone else, the young Alexander had proved himself in this great feat, and this became the horse that he would take into battle. But Alexander the Great is great for the things that he did while he was alive, but mainly for his legend that lasted afterward. The main question for today is, how did the Persian Empire unintentionally militarize the Greeks, and as a result, engineer their own downfall, meaning the Persian downfall? The big empire on the block at this time is the Persians. They're an actual empire. They conquered other peoples and enlisted those peoples into their military. They had the largest military around. They greatly outnumbered the Greeks. The Persians were constantly at the Greek border, taking part in their own domestic and foreign affairs. The Greco-Persian Wars in our era, which actually helped usher in the strength of Athens and even Athenian democracy and the Athenian Empire. It's the wars with the Persians and the Greeks who would militarize initially the Greeks. So our question is, how did the Persian Empire unintentionally militarize the Greeks? Well, initially, when we're talking about like the movie 300, or with Thermopylae, or with the War of Marathon, or the Battle of Salamis, some very epic battles at this time where the Persians were either beat or stalled, this unintentionally militarized the Greeks, because if you are constantly being attacked and fending them off, you're going to build a stronger, bigger military. And so in ancient times, when we talk about militarization, we're actually often talking about what I'm phrasing here as unintentional militarization. What I mean by that is, yes, the Persians are attacking the Greeks on purpose, but their intention was to defeat the Greeks and make them subject states. Even though they did that to most of them, and many of them, they didn't fully subjugate the Greeks. So therefore, the Greeks were able to continue advancing their own military technology. After the Persians failed to take Greece, Sparta and Athens became giant. Sparta became the greatest infantry, it already was, but it became very large and influential and started calling the shots for the rest of its little Peloponnesian area. Sparta became really big, but then the Athenians realized that they could create a huge navy, and they basically ruled their section of the Mediterranean. Both Greece in general and the Athenian navy grew very large as a result of Persian invasions. But take an earlier example of the Assyrian Empire during the Bronze Age, where the Assyrians were in the north of Mesopotamia. We know where Mesopotamia is now, in northern Iraq. We've already spoken about that. But the Assyrians were not the highly populated, highly intelligent, excellent education system. They didn't have that. They didn't have great soil like they did in other parts of Mesopotamia along the rivers. They were in more of a mountainous region, but they spoke a similar dialect. They wrote a style of cuneiform. They were a subject state for the longest time. But what's different about Assyria, they're in the north next to the mountains. North of the mountains are the steppes. The steppes hold what we should probably fear the most, and that is horse-riding, nomadic, raiding, pillaging peoples. We're in the steppes. The steppes are basically grasslands. You have to have grasslands if you're a horse warrior society, so the horses can eat wherever they are. You can't haul in wagons, all your food for the horse, that would defeat the purpose in many ways. In the steppes, you actually had your nomadic horse-riding tribes, and their economy was based off plundering other people. And so these nomadic peoples would plunder and terrorize the Assyrians in the north. Well, they didn't bother anybody else in Mesopotamia. They were too far away. So the Assyrians were some of the first to actually militarize to a high level, and once they did that, they dominated their neighbors. So the Assyrian Empire is one of your most aggressive empires. If you watch Game of Thrones, anybody watch Game of Thrones in here? What's the signature move of the House of Bolton? The flayed man. So the House Bolton, I think they're based off the Assyrians. The Assyrians were known to take their opponents, peel their flesh, all their flesh off, and then hang them outside, either upside down or on a wheel or something. And so Assyrians were known to create great horror into the minds of their enemies. In Mesopotamia, Turkey, anywhere else, they developed a very advanced chariot technology that they learned from these steppes peoples, these horse riding cultures. We think that these northern steppes peoples were the first to invent the chariot. Then the Assyrians got it. Then the Egyptians got it. So we see that Assyria militarized early, and so not only did they militarize early, their war technology was just much more advanced. They knew that if you were a warlike society, you would have to strike terror into your enemies. So they developed these really sort of advanced, gruesome psychological techniques, as well as physical military techniques. So you see that same phenomenon with the Persians and the Greeks. They unintentionally militarized them. Those steppes people, they didn't want the Assyrians to become amazing warriors who could defend themselves. They would rather keep pillaging them, right? So I say unintentional. Okay, so after the Greco-Persian Wars, you had a great war that Thucydides writes about called the Peloponnesian War. And this is mainly the Athenian Empire and their allies and subject states versus the Spartans and their allies. Great epic battle. Now remember, the Athenians, of course, had the greatest navy. The Spartans had the greatest infantry. So it's very similar to France and England during the 100 Years' War, for example, or after the 100 Years' War, where the Brits had an amazing, unrivaled navy, but they couldn't compete with the French on the ground, especially during the time of Louis XIV. So you see these two powers constantly playing a chess game and no one really getting the upper hand. Well, once again, we have the Persians. They get involved. They help the Spartans out. Ends up, the Athenians lose the Great Peloponnesian War because of Persian intervention. So the Persians are constantly coming back in and influencing the state of affairs in Greece. So this is the downfall of the Athenian Empire. No more radical democracy, but no more horrible empire either. It's kind of ironic that you would have your peak of radical democracy alongside Athens' most cruel imperial state. So the Athenians fall, they have to tear down their walls, they become much weaker. They do eventually build in power. And the Persians aren't always playing their hand in Greek affairs. So for a while, Sparta gets strong again. Thebes, to the north of Athens, becomes very powerful. And it's constantly doing war with Sparta. And so Thebes militarizes. And they have some of your best generals of the land. They began imitating Sparta slightly. Sparta has full-time soldiers, unlike the rest of Greece. A full-time soldier is only made possible when you have farmers and other people, slaves at this time, who are basically providing for that soldier. So to make full-time soldiers possible in Sparta, the Spartans enslaved their neighbors and made their neighbors, the Messenians, do all the farming for them and all the work. And so a certain number of Spartan males could train full-time and live in the barracks full-time and become great soldiers. Well, the Thebans began to do this too, and they created an amazing military. They increased military technology. They had a special unit called the Sacred Band. The Sacred Band is a formation. Now remember, the phalanx is your main formation at this time. It's just a square of people. Well, the Thebes start developing greater technologies because Greeks are superior to Persians at war, and the Thebans began increasing this greatly, so they become even more dominant. So the Sacred Band is actually a long diagonal row of two men standing next to each other, And so you would actually form sort of a diagonal unit that could flank others and could prevent itself from being flanked, either around the back or around the side. And that was just one of the units of Thebes that became really popular. The sacred band became just as well known and feared as the Spartans. So they became the Theban sacred band becomes almost just as well respected as the Spartans. And so Thebes begins carrying a lot of the strength. This is where Philip II, the king of Macedon, comes in. Before he's the king of Macedon, he is something ruling aristocracy often practice, which has to do with you take the sons of your allies, the sons of kings who are your allies and subjects, and you bring them to your own estate and raise them yourself. So in a way, it's like being a prisoner, but it's like a royal prisoner. And so this is what happened with Philip. Macedon was one of the subjects of the great Thebes city-state. And so Philip was raised learning military tactics and techniques from the best generals around. He was a great student of military endeavor. He was trained in these newer techniques, and then when he became king of Macedon, he increased those techniques himself. Philip of Macedon innovated the sarissa. Anybody know what the sarissa is? Usually when hoplites fight, they'll have their spears out here. Then you might have a second row of spears. And what Philip the Great did is he made the sarissas a lot longer. And so the sarissa would be just incredibly long. I mean, if you would carry it around with you and it would just tower above your head. Everyone had to carry their own spear. So what happens, it's really a numbers game. Philip, by increasing the length of the spear, you can actually put more spearheads in the front. So whether it's infantry with their spears or people on horses, cavalry units, it's actually much more difficult to get through. So by increasing the length of the spear, the sarissa, you increase the number of spearheads that are in the front of the front line. Very important tactic. Why? Because Philip would go to dominate all of Greece. This is Alexander the Great's father. Without Philip II, Alexander the Great would not have happened. Well, yes, obviously, he's his father and he wouldn't have been born, but Alexander would not have accomplished anything great without Philip. Philip set it all up. Philip took control of Greece, and Alexander inherited the reward. So let's go back to the sacred band. Alexander, we already know the story of Alexander and his horse, a great feat. It helped build his reputation, but there's another thing that helped his reputation when he was a little bit older. He was atop his horse Bucephalus when Thebes, remember, the most powerful place around, revolted against Philip of Macedon once he subjugated Greece. And so Philip created war with Thebes and the sacred band. The sacred band is your most elite fighting force. It's a rather unique concept. What the Theban city-state decided to do, they wanted to create the ultimate sort of group of soldiers. So what they did is they took homosexual warriors. So when you have these two circles here, two circles here, two circles here, these are actually male lovers who fight side by side. And so they're going to protect each other. They're going to watch each other's back is the theory, and they're going to fight passionately to protect each other and that sort of thing. And so the sacred band's rather unique. They have quite a reputation. Well, in the war between Philip and Thebes, Alexander heads the cavalry unit that destroys the sacred band, wipes them out. Alexander the Great wipes out the sacred band. And so he's building quite a reputation. Philip, Alexander, and the Persians. Because Macedon is in the north of Greece, Macedon was often the subject state of Persia. Throughout the course of a few hundred years, Macedon would often be the subject of Persia. And so Philip changed all that. Philip actually unified all of the nobility of Macedon and basically put all of Greece under his control. And when Alexander was young, his father had to go away for a war. And a Persian delegate came and visited the court. And as Alexander sat on the throne taking in diplomats and that sort of thing, Alexander really impressed the Persians because he would ask them certain questions about like how many troops did they have and different questions about administration and the military. And so the Persians were already very impressed by young Alexander. And so the Persians kind of always had at least one finger in the Macedonian court. If they weren't controlling things, they often had communication and knew what was happening around. So they knew that Macedonia was getting big and that Philip was actually raising an army to attack the Persians. He was raising a huge army to just wipe out the Persians and free up Greek cities in Turkey on the coast that the Persians have already dominated. And so Philip was already planning to take on the Persians, and he was assassinated. And so Alexander stepped in. And so we have the story of Alexander wiping out the Persian Empire and becoming the king of Asia. But his father was the one that was going to do it. Just the year before the attack, Philip was assassinated, so Alexander stepped right in. So we might be talking about Philip the Great today, not Alexander, if he had not been assassinated. So Alexander the Great indeed becomes Alexander the Great, takes on the Persians, wipes them out. Long story short, he becomes the king of Asia. He also becomes a god. Before Alexander defeats the Persians, he rides down to Egypt, goes outside of Egypt into the desert to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. It still exists, actually. And he goes in and asks the oracle for advice. The oracle tells him that you are my son. And so Alexander, even though there had been some rumors about Alexander's sort of mystical birth, there were rumors that a snake crawled into bed with his mother, and that's how he was conceived, and that the snake was a form of Zeus. His mother was a big into the Dionysian mysteries, so she did a lot of snaky dancing and stuff like that. So there was already some rumors that Alexander was descended from some sort of deity. And so he confirms this at Oracle of Siwa, so he is now a son of Ammon. And Ammon is basically Zeus Ammon. So he's now proclaiming himself to be a living god. And right after he does that, he becomes the king of Asia and brings together the empire. So you see in this question, how did the Persian Empire unintentionally militarize the Greeks? We just went from classical era to the end of the classical era with this question. They militarized the Greeks, and they brought about their own downfall in the form of Alexander the Great. But if you want to know the story of Philip was assassinated by one of his ex-lovers, a male ex-lover, but Philip had treated him badly. And he like his ex-male lover was in the military, was like a general. And he was actually, there was another general who was jealous of him. And so this group of soldiers went out and gang raped Philip's ex-male lover. And Philip didn't do anything about it. He just said, so what? And so Philip's ex-lover assassinated him. So he had a motive, but we don't know if there were other people behind it. When the assassin killed Philip, he ran to a horse. There were two horses waiting. We don't know what the other horse was for, sort of thing. So there's a lot of mystery, and there's mystery around Alexander's death as well. And so this is the great ballad that ends the classical era and brings in the Hellenistic era. And I hope I went through some of that so fast, but I hope the general arc of events makes sense to you. How the Persians militarized the Greeks, through the Greeks, and then the Athenians and the Spartans and the Thebans, and then Philip right to Alexander. You get a continuous line of militarization. But how did the Persian Empire unintentionally militarize the Greeks and as a result engineer their own downfall?